Hi, we're here to talk about the Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien and this work of literature and where it stands in relationship to the rest of the things that we're reading. The Silmarillion is the key to everything else that Tolkien writes. It is the book that he is working on the longest. He actually never finishes it, and what we have is published posthumously after his death in 1977. And the book, however, contains all of the mythology, all of the backstory, all of the critical context information for what happens in his more famous books, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, which we'll talk about in other videos. But this Silmarillion book, it's got a funny name. A lot of people aren't familiar with it. So why is it worth reading now? And why should you engage with it? I'm going to argue that it's great literature and it's beautiful. And as we have said in other videos on other topics, Christians should be engaging with the beautiful, the true, and the good. And as those things relate and interact with each other, all coming into the character of God and who He is, we should take value and approach the beautiful things in this world and take them seriously for their own merit. The other thing that I think is so helpful about understanding and thinking well about the Silmarillion is The Lord of the Rings clearly has a monumental influence on our culture. Both the books and now even more so the movies that have come out, Tolkien's influence in the culture is widespread and diverse. And in addition to that, Tolkien's influence on fantasy literature it's almost impossible to overemphasize. Everyone coming after Tolkien is standing in his shadow and being influenced by him. And if this is his critical work to understanding his vision of his cosmology, his vision of the world that he's built, all of that is going to be helpful in not just understanding better his own works later on, but understanding the context and kind of storytelling expectations and norms of fantasy literature going forward. So whether or not Tolkien is your favorite author, whether or not The Hobbit is your favorite book, the Silmarillion is a book that's going to help you understand a lot about modern fantasy literature, modern storytelling generally speaking, and unpacking the themes that he is wrestling with is going to be of value to you, wrestling with the good, the true, and the beautiful. So, to start briefly looking at Tolkien in his context, the world that he is living in that produces part of this world that he writes about, you have to understand that Tolkien is a creature of Victorian and Edwardian England. So the Victorian era, Queen Victoria is on the throne for most of the 1800s, and Tolkien is coming into his own and beginning to write, or at least coming into his own as a man, at the end of her reign and into the reign of King Edward, who follows her. And the critical context of this period of English history is, I would argue, for understanding the Silmarillion well, informed by really two key components: modernism and the Industrial Revolution. Modernism is the philosophy that we kind of attach to as the product of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment rationalism, and swept through Europe, swept through much of the world, coming out of the Middle Ages, and it's a project that really continues for centuries, influencing the life and the mind of European thinkers. And we don't have time to go too deep into this, but the critical elements of modernism that I would be drawing your attention to in the context of this book are its emphasis on rationalism, its emphasis on materialism, the fact that it is massively individualistic, and also this very important element of optimism that is involved in modernism. And Tolkien is a Christian. He's coming out of the Catholic Church. However, we have no reason to doubt his personal theology to any meaningful way about his walk with Christ. He's a Christian. And so he's looking at the modernist worldview and modernist philosophy and seeing all of the cracks and all of the problems with this man-focused, saving ourselves vision of the world that reduces so much of God's creation to simply the material stuff and humans figuring it out for themselves and ultimately saving themselves. The other piece that is informing Tolkien's experience and vision of the world is the Industrial Revolution. England and the Great Britain is going through a massive expansion of wealth, a massive expansion of urbanization, and the world is changing in an extremely profound way from an era that we are going through horse-drawn carriages, horse-drawn plows. You travel at the speed of the sailboat versus a transformation that experiences in Tolkien's lifetime of steam power, steam engines, the internal combustion engine, tanks, things like that, airplanes. even going to the moon eventually by the end of his life. This is a massive, massive transformation in human civilization, and all of this is going into his writing. And personally, Tolkien is massively shaped by a couple particular events. He fights in World War I, when this modernist world explodes and, in some ways, destroys itself, at least this optimistic vision of it, destroys itself on the fields of World War I, going through the Great Depression and into World War II. Tolkien is right at the epicenter of that to participate in it and be shaped by it. So this is his world. Tolkien, as well, is a philologist. He is a studier and massively interested in language. That is where his expertise is, particularly in Saxon, Norse, myth, things like that, Germanic languages. That's where his academic expertise is. And so he is in the weeds and in the nuts and bolts of deep understanding of Norse, Saxon mythology. And we hear that now, and some of our radars might be going up. Why is he so interested in these pagan myths? Why is he so interested in all of these influences that are flagrantly non-Christian? And this is why understanding his context as a modernist one is so important, because what Tolkien is, in very broad summary, going to be saying in so much of his literature is the pagans are wrong. They're wrong about who God is, they're wrong about his nature, and they're wrong about our relationship to God. But what they do get right is that there is a God, and that the world is defined by spiritual reality, and that ultimate reality is not materialistic, individualistic, defined by reason, that's not the way that the world works. The world works at the supernatural level. God is on his throne, providentially overseeing his creation, and that has never changed. And so what Tolkien is going to be presenting through his incorporation of all of these myths, all of this pagan imagery, all of this reaching back into the stories of the past to draw forth into his own story, is he's trying to help the modern world see, again, the capital M modern world, to see you have it worse and more wrong than the ancient pagans did. Because, yeah, they're wrong about who Jesus was and his relationship to us and what he's done for us on the cross. They don't know any of that, and they're ignorant of it, but at least they understand that there is a God that we have to reckon with, and you don't even recognize that kind of most fundamental feature of reality. So, getting into the text, getting into the actual document itself, the Silmarillion, a couple of themes that you need to be paying attention to that Tolkien is going to emphasize throughout the entire text is that of, one, creation and subcreation. The book begins with God, or the God figure in Tolkien's literature, creating the world. And it has this incredibly beautiful sequence of God using the singing of his angelic host to draw into creation his vision for the world and the material existence that elves and men, hobbits and dwarves and everybody's going to inhabit. And God, at this very beginning step, as the creator God, the author of the universe, inviting his creation into the further creation of things after it. And this is something that Tolkien sees not just in the Silmarillion, but all of his work, this emphasis of our image-bearingness coming out in being little creators, that we make things, we're driven to make things and make things beautiful as a reflection of our image-bearingness after God. However, it's never fully complete, and it's very easily perverted. In this sequence, this is also where we see sin entering into God's world in the context of Tolkien's universe. We see his beginning of meditation on what sin looks like. And this is one of Tolkien's other great strengths in all of his literature, that Tolkien is very strong and very biblical on the nature of what sin is. Sin is not some rival cosmic power to God. Sin is not some, dualistic Manichaean opposition force to that which is good. Sin and evil is the perversion, the inversion of the good thing that God has made. And if God is the agent and author of creation had not brought something into existence, sin wouldn't be possible, because it wouldn't be shaped and possible for us to invert or change or corrupt what God has given to us. But there is no direct authorship with regard to sin. Everything that the devil figure in the Silmarillion, the character of Melkor or Morgoth, depending on where you're reading it, the figure of Satan, he is only able to corrupt, to try and disrupt God's plan and the influence of what he's trying to create and bring into being. And yet also, even just at the dawn of creation, Tolkien is drawing our attention to God resolving this, God using it to bring his plan to completion. And all of that stage is set from the very, very dawn of this story. And then the rest of it is unpacking how God is going to do that and the role of providence through this process. Providence is another thing to be having your eyes open for throughout this book as you read it. Tolkien, again, is very solidly biblical on this point and very worth reading to explore how he unpacks this in a literary sense. Contrary to another author, kind of like Lewis or other figures that we can point to in fantasy literature, Tolkien meditates on God's providence as something that is subtle, that is something that is often overlooked, or that operates in unexpected ways. I'll just briefly contrast what Tolkien does in his stories to, say, Aslan in the Narnia books with Lewis. Aslan is active. Aslan is actively present. He's charging into situations. He's intervening in very obvious ways most of the time. And at times, that happens in Tolkien's literature as well, but it's the very, very odd occurrence and out of the norm circumstance. Most of the time, what you see is God's providential plan working through in very subtle, even unintended ways, where God takes what man meant for evil, so to speak, and turns it to good and accomplishes his purposes. So, the last thing that I'll comment on the text by way of preparing you to engage with this book, you should not go into it expecting a narrative in the sense of Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. This book is much more closely a history book than it is a singular coherent narrative. We're dealing with sweeps of time in Tolkien's fiction that stretch thousands and thousands of years. And so the dialogue is brief, the pace is quick relative to the time jumps. And so if you go into it expecting to read Lord of the Rings Part 2, you are going to leave disappointed, and your expectations are not going to be met. But if you come to this with the expectation of, I want to better understand Lewis's worldview, I want to better understand how he thinks himself and how he approaches the world around him, and demonstrating that in his literature, and you go in expecting and understanding this is much more history and much more an unpacking of the way the world works, you'll be far better equipped to appreciate and understand the beauty of what Tolkien has made, not just in this book, but in the entire project of the universe that he's created.